Sometimes wars are decided not on the front lines, not in massive artillery duels or sweeping tank offensives, but in silence, in abandoned villages, in the darkness where only a handful of men moved through ruins with rifles in their hands. That was a reality for Gray's group. 6 Special Forces soldiers assigned to a mission that looked straightforward on paper, but in truth was as dangerous as walking on glass. Their orders were clear. Move behind enemy lines, assess how many armored vehicles were being funneled into the sector, confirm intelligence about new supply depots, and if possible, prepare the ground for a future strike. The area was critical. Russian forces had begun stockpiling fuel and ammunition dangerously close to the line of fire. If left untouched, these supplies would tip the balance in upcoming battles. Destroying them meant saving countless Ukrainian lives. The mission fell to Gray, a seasoned officer with years of covert experience. He checked everything twice: infiltration routes, fallback plans, even the silence protocol for their radios. Every detail mattered. Yet, despite the careful preparation, Gray couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The first leg of the journey passed quietly. Vehicles carried them as far as safe territory allowed. Then they disembarked, vanishing into the night on foot. Step by step, they approached their designated observation zone. Their route took them through a deserted village, crumbling houses, sagging fences, broken furniture left behind. Silence so thick, each heartbeat felt too loud. The men advanced in pairs, scanning every corner, every shadow. They even checked abandoned sheds. One barn in particular felt off. Its door was slightly ajar, as if recently disturbed. Inside, nothing but broken tools. Yet the uneasy feeling lingered. Someone had been there. The group split into observation posts. 2 men set up positions with clear sight lines. The rest dug into a cellar with thick walls and a hidden exit. Everything was done by the book. And then the waiting began, weapons ready, eyes fixed through scopes, nerves wound tight. Hours passed. Then, as night deepened, one of the lookouts spotted movement on the edge of the village, shadows slipping between trees. At first, he thought it was his imagination. But no, they were real. They moved quietly, cautiously, like professionals. And in that moment, Gray knew they weren't alone. The movement on the tree line wasn't random. Gray watched through a scope as the silhouettes advanced with careful discipline. These weren't villagers sneaking home, nor looters scavenging ruins. They were armed, trained, and moving in formation. A Russian reconnaissance group. Gray gave the silent hand signal. His men froze in position. Heartbeats slowed, breaths controlled. They had seconds to decide. Retreating meant abandoning the mission and exposing themselves on open ground. Fighting head-on was suicide. The enemy had numbers. The only option was the one Gray had used countless times in his career. Set the trap. Turn the hunters into the hunted. Preparing the kill zone. The team worked silently like a machine. 2 men slipped into flanking positions, wiring explosives along a narrow street choked with debris. Others adjusted firing angles from the cellar and second floors of collapsed houses. Every soldier checked his sights, preloaded spare magazines, and waited for command. Gray whispered into the radio, his voice calm, deliberate. Wait for them to enter the street. No shots before my mark. The enemy moves in. The Russian group crept forward, unaware of the danger. Their point man scanned with thermal scope, sweeping across the ruins, but the Ukrainians were buried too deep in shadows to be seen. Step by step, the Russians entered the abandoned village. One paused near the very barn Gray's men had inspected earlier, checking the door. Another moved toward the central street, the exact spot wired with explosives. Through his binoculars, Gray could see their faces now. Focused, confident, they believed they had the upper hand. They thought they were closing in on unsuspecting prey. The signal. The lead Russian raised his hand, signaling the group to spread out. That was the moment Gray had been waiting for. He pressed the detonator. The street exploded in a roar of fire and shrapnel. 3 soldiers were thrown to the ground instantly, their bodies crumpling into the dust. The rest panicked, diving for cover. But before they could react, Gray's men opened fire. Controlled bursts, precise, methodical, every shot counted. Chaos erupted. The Russians had walked straight into a kill zone. Bullets ricocheted, smoke filled the air, and shadows became targets. The village, silent for hours, now thundered with gunfire and explosions. The cost. But in war, no ambush comes without a price. One of Gray's men on the flank took a hit, collapsing behind a ruined fence. Another's radio went dead mid-shout. Gray clenched his jaw. They had sprung the trap, but survival was not guaranteed. The Russians, though bloodied, were still fighting back, and reinforcements might not be far. The mission to gather intelligence had just become a desperate battle for survival. The firefight raged for nearly 20 minutes. Grenades exploded against crumbling walls, automatic fire shredded wooden fences, and the air filled with dust and smoke. Gray's group fought like ghosts, shifting positions, firing short, precise bursts. For every meter the Russians tried to advance, they paid with blood. The turning point. Amid the chaos, one Russian soldier made a mistake. Disoriented, he rushed from cover into the open street, tried to regroup with his comrades. Gray's men seized the moment. 3 rifles cracked almost at once, cutting down those around him, while the lone soldier dropped his weapon and raised his hands in panic. He was dragged into the cellar, their first and only prisoner. Interrogation in the dark. In the dim light of the ruined basement, the prisoner sat trembling, mud and blood on his uniform. At first, he refused to speak, mumbling rehearsed lines about being just a conscript. But Gray had seen enough men to know the difference. This one wasn't ordinary infantry. His gear was new, his radio encrypted, and his movements had been professional. Under pressure, the man finally cracked. He admitted their unit had been lying in wait for days. The Russians hadn't stumbled onto Gray's group by chance. They knew the Ukrainians would pass through this very village. Their orders were clear: intercept and destroy. Gray's men exchanged glances in the shadows. It was confirmation of what he had feared from the start. Someone, somewhere, had given away their route, the seed of betrayal. The revelation hit harder than the gunfire outside. If the enemy had been tipped off, then this mission had never been a fair fight. It wasn't caution or luck that brought the Russians here. It was planning, and that planning could only come from foreknowledge. Gray's jaw tightened as he processed the prisoner's words. Was there a leak in their own command structure? A compromised line of communication? Or, the thought that chilled him most, a traitor among those they trusted? The questions hung in the air like smoke, but there was no time for answers. Outside, Russian reinforcements were closing in, their shouts echoing through the ruins. The trap had been sprung both ways, and Gray's men would have to fight their way out before the circle closed completely. The prisoner's words still echoed in Gray's mind when the first burst of machine gun fire rattled against the walls of the cellar. Reinforcements had arrived. The Russians weren't probing anymore. They were storming, breaking contact. Gray knew staying was suicide. He gave the order. We move. Now. His men prepared smoke grenades, covering the exit with a choking cloud that bought them seconds of concealment. Then they slipped into the ruins, darting between collapsed fences and craters, firing short bursts to keep the enemy's heads down. Bullets snapped past their ears. Mortar shells began to fall, shattering what was left of the village. Dust and shrapnel rained from above. Every step felt like walking through fire. The losses. One of the flankers, already wounded in the ambush, stumbled as they crossed an open street. He tried to rise, but a burst of gunfire cut him down. Another soldier dragged him several meters before Gray ordered him to let go. There was no time, no chance. The silence on the radio after that moment was heavier than any explosion. Further ahead, another man was grazed in the leg, but refused to stop. He gritted his teeth, limped on, leaning on a comrade's shoulder. Their group was shrinking with every 100 meters, but their will to break out only hardened. Through the trap, the Russians pushed hard, shouting, firing, closing in from 3 sides. Gray's men responded with discipline, setting claymores as they withdrew, tossing grenades into alleys, forcing their pursuers to slow. Each blast bought them a few more breaths, a few more meters. At the edge of the village, the terrain opened into fields broken by hedgerows. Here the Russians tried to cut them off with machine guns placed in the tree line, Gray himself crawled forward, sighted through his rifle, and dropped the gun with a single shot. His men surged past, sprinting low, dragging the wounded, lungs burning. The price paid. By the time they reached the relative safety of the woods, the group was half the size it had been when it entered the village. Exhausted, bloodied, but alive, they collapsed into cover. Silence returned, but it was a silence filled with absence. Empty spaces where comrades should have been. Gray counted them, his jaw set like stone. The mission was technically a success. They had uncovered the ambush, destroyed the enemy's advance unit, and lived to bring back vital intelligence. But the cost was written on every face, every empty seat among them. The group had survived, but survival came with a bitter taste. When the survivors finally returned to their own lines, they carried more than just rifles and exhaustion. They carried knowledge, proof that the enemy had prepared an attack weeks in advance, and that without their ambush in the village, it would have struck Ukrainian positions with devastating force. Gray's men had broken the spine of that plan. Heroes and ghosts. At debriefing, commanders praised the group for preventing what could have been a catastrophe. Intelligence gathered from the captured enemy, combined with battlefield evidence, exposed the scale of the Russian preparations. Gray's ambush had shattered it in a single night, yet every word of praise felt heavy. The men in that room knew the cost, names that would never answer roll call again, brothers who had bought survival with their lives. The shadow of betrayal. The unanswered question remained. How had the Russians known their route? Whether through intercepted communications, a leak, or deliberate betrayal, Gray never found out. But the doubt lingered like a wound that never heals. It reminded everyone that in war, danger does not only come from the front. It can seep through cracks in trust. The price of victory. For the people back home, the story became one of heroism, a small group that stopped an attack plan for weeks. For the soldiers themselves, it was a story of survival marked by sacrifice. Gray often repeated a single line when asked what happened that night. We won, but we paid the price. The lesson, the operation of Gray's group entered military lore not because of the enemy they killed, but because of the comrades they lost, a reminder that even victories carry scars. It was proof that wars are not decided only by numbers and strategies, but by the courage of small groups who stand when everything seems lost. And so the story of Gray's men was told and retold across the trenches, a warning about betrayal, a tale of sacrifice, and a symbol that sometimes the greatest victories are those that come at the heaviest cost.